Well, so while you're finishing up your meal and such, just a video montage of sights and scenery of Ireland. Just kind of enjoy that. Just out of curiosity, how many of you been to Ireland? Just a show of hands. And so Phil, whereabouts in Ireland did you travel? Okay. Okay. Very good. Who else had their hands up? Karen, where you and Pete? Okay. Mostly south. Okay, so the eastern side and down south and towards the center. Okay. Dublin? Okay. Where did you travel to, Norm? It was scary? Oh, Kerry. Well, I mean, Dublin can be scary. Town, yes, right. Okay. Anyone else have their hands up? Where? And where? Galway. Dublin, Galway. How many of you? Oh, okay. Galway and Cliffs of Moher. And Dublin's kind of the most popular of the sites and cities, largest city in Ireland. How many of you are, to whatever extent, Irish? Wow. Look at all of these drunks. No, that's not nice. But my experience is, and I could be way off base on saying this, but there are a lot more pubs in Ireland than there are in the UK. And they're good. I mean they're like the UK. The pubs of Ireland are gathering places. Families come down. Music is played, and it's kind of the center of town. And the food, which is not all good, but it's a pub. So at any rate, okay. Well, I hope this works. Switch that on. No, Gia is, and she's better than Jack. Well, so tonight I just want to share with you some reflections that I have about St. Patrick largely, and Ireland. Obviously, the connection is significant. Some of this I have shared in a previous presentation. Some of this is brand new. Some of this is made up. We'll see. Ireland, as you know, is an island. And not a lot of people know that, too, by the way. I mean, according to SAT tests and such, a large number of graduating high school students do not know that Ireland is an island. And I'll talk a little bit about specific locale as we go through on this that are relevant to Patrick himself. But St. Patrick, as we know of him, did not wear green, did not have anything to say about a three-leaf clover, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Chances are he did not drink green beer, and this whole connection with leprechauns and stuff, there was really no leprechauns. And then finally, he did not remove the snakes from Ireland, and I'll mention a little bit more about that in a second. The problem is, much about what we know of St. Patrick is very scattered. and there isn't a lot of verifiable historic information. There are two things that St. Patrick wrote that we have. One is called the Confessio, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, but it is rather a lengthy description, and it's probably the most informative piece of literature that he talks about coming to Ireland, both originally and as a slave and then secondarily as a missionary. The second thing that he wrote is called A Letter to the Soldiers of Caractacus, and he gives no personal information. It's written to soldiers who were Christians and kind of outlining what their moral obligations were in fulfilling their responsibilities. And having said that, 150 years after he passes away, St. Patrick passes away, there were two individuals who began collecting mythologies of St. Patrick, these stories. And they evidently, these two individuals who did not work together, they were separate, went to towns and heard fantastic things, and they wrote it down as historic fact. So the language, for instance, about St. Patrick exorcising the island from snakes. Well, it didn't happen. There never has been snakes in Ireland. But it was one of the myths that came up, which, by the way, if you are a golfer and you know there are no snakes, oh, it's great. It's wonderful. Other stories where Patrick was told of fighting the Druid priests, physically fighting them. These authors presented, or these stories presented Patrick as very militaristic, and they further kind of warped the way in which the populace began to think about his activities. There was some suspicion that Patrick may have been, how do you put this kindly, inappropriately mixing with women in his services. Which again, I'm going to tell you, I do believe that was truly a myth. But having said that, and I'll touch upon this in a second, a lot of the nunneries were begun by Patrick, and largely drawing these wealthy women away from their families and into these nunneries. And so you can imagine now how some stories might begin to crop up about his activities. Again, it's 150 years after Patrick died, and so a lot of these stories very clearly were mythological. But a possible reason for these stories to come up was about the 7th century. Ireland began to go through a huge religious shift, whereby the Catholic Church, largely under the auspices of the Bishop of Yorkshire, or of York in the UK, began to want to corral the image of Patrick as a Roman Catholic powerhouse, and they needed some sense of this guy who did supernatural things to kind of rise to the fore and gain kind of a national strengthening for the Catholic Church in Ireland. All that aside, these popular myths also arose in the 1300s to the 1500s, which that was one of the periods in which this idea of the three-leaf clover as being a teaching method that Patrick used to talk about the Trinity. That largely came out from the 1300s to the 1700s, somewhere around there as well. As I mentioned, the banishment of the snakes was a late entry into the mythologies. Another one of the mythologies of Patrick was that he was kind of like a Old Testament prophet that separated himself from everybody else and dressed strange clothes and would take on these, well, spiritual battles with the Druid kings and goddesses and gods. So you see this image of Patrick evidently with fire somehow castigating the evil presence from around him. A lot of this stuff, again, began to become very popular in as late as the 1700s. One particular story has Patrick exorcising a demon from a woman's house, and the way that he did it was he commanded the woman to drink whiskey. And as long as she drank whiskey, then the demon would no longer bother her. And you can see where this goes. It became then the popular cultural medium that drinking whiskey would be done on every March 17th. And maybe you've heard the terminology. I had not, but they call that drowning the shamrock. Again, based on this story that this woman had to drink whiskey to keep the demon out of her house. The chances are there was another demon that entered the house. So much the case. Well, so Patrick, we're not sure when he was born. Likely the latter part of the 300s, probably around 380. And chances are he is born on the west coast of England, though we're not exactly sure where. The thought is that he came from the region of what is today Wales, but some scholars argue that there were other locations in England that he could have been from. And there's one tradition, scholarship tradition, that places his birth in Kilpatrick, Scotland. But again, that's kind of a variant. I wouldn't put a lot of credibility in that. He is born, however, into Roman nobility. His grandfather was a priest, and his father was a deacon. You might ask, how did that work? If the grandfather was a priest, he ends up having a child. Well, in those days, you could. It was permissible for priests in the late 3rd century to marry. So at any rate, he comes from a sense of nobility, but likely, like many teenagers, like many of you who were teenagers, I can just point the finger at you, the Christian faith was not a high priority for Patrick in his formative years. He was as much a carefree individual and looked forward to the nicer things in life. But one night, he's about 16 years old, and a marauding group of pirates landed on the west coast of Ireland, or west coast of Wales, Britain area, from Ireland, and they come ashore, and they capture Patrick and other people as well. There's also some reports that it wasn't just a capturing party, it was a marauding army that came ashore and raped and pillaged and did horrible things and then took the young boys with them back to Ireland. That's likely the reality that we're looking at here. So Patrick is purchased by a Druid tribal chief, and he is sent to be a shepherd on the west coast of Ireland. In a second, we'll see some images of where that could be. For the cultured Roman Empire, of which Britain was a part of, the world ended on the west coast of Great Britain. So Ireland was considered another world. A dangerous world, a world that you wouldn't want to travel to. And because only pagans lived in this uncivilized, barbaric location where there was possibility of human sacrificing taking place. So at any rate, Patrick is purchased by this tribal chief by the name of Milchu, Milchu, a Druid priest from the northern part of Ireland. And they land first in the area around Waterford. So think kind of on the east coast, on the southern part of the island. And then they travel, taking a full month to arrive at a new home in the north central part of Ireland. The location is where Patrick then largely becomes a shepherd on the slopes of a place called Slemish, which historically is called Slieve Mish. It's the hill country atrium in Ireland. The country, before the country is, of course, divided into two locations, about where Belfast is today. So while tending the sheep in this widespread western exposure to the western Atlantic Ocean, two things happen to Patrick. First thing is that he gets to know the Irish, and he becomes proficient in speaking. Now, Ireland, we're talking in a period of time when there is no Irish country. It is a bunch of fiefdoms that are kind of woven together with pacts and so forth. And each fiefdom basically has their own language and their own style and cultural. And so if I understand this correctly, there were four basic regions that made up Ireland in those days. And this would have been the far northern region called Ulster. So if you hear the word Ulster, Ulster refers to a regional area. And they have their own language. And again, if you've traveled to Ireland, you know that you can talk to somebody and not understand a single word they're saying because they're speaking, a different language. It's not English. It's highly unintelligible. And you can get two Irish people coming together, and they're both speaking their cultural languages, and they don't understand one another either. So it's a very challenging world to live in, but they make it work. They do. So at any rate, we're talking that they're up in the northern region, and so he begins to speak the language and get to know the people. He understands their values, the things that mean the most to them, the things that, and he begins to have a heart for the Irish. The second thing that happens to Patrick, and this happens to a lot of people, including many of you too, I would imagine, that if you grew up in the faith, and at least your family was faithful, and as a teenager, you kind of drag your feet, and doesn't all that mean that much. But then let's say you go to a college, and the college you go to is across the United States. Well, then you begin to do some introspection and think about some of the values that you were raised with, and you begin to reconsider, maybe there's something to this Christianity. Well, that's what happened to Patrick. His faith becomes real for him. It has to, because it's like the thing that's going to ground him. It's going to give him a sense of hope. He recognizes as a slave, he's extremely vulnerable. He's a non-person. He's not going to have any credibility, let alone security in Ireland. And so this faith that he was raised in becomes important to him, and he begins to pray. And he begins, as he writes in his Confessio, that I would pray constantly during the daylight hours, and the love of God surrounded me more and more. Finally, one night, 6 years into his responsibility of being a shepherd, he hears a voice telling him it's now time to go back home. Well, so if he was 14 when he was abducted, now 6 years later, early 20s. And so he sneaks away at night, and he travels by foot 200 miles across Ireland, eventually boards a ship. I have no idea how he gains right to the ship. There are some stories that have been told about that, but I don't know what's verifiable. He does gain ship steerage to on a ship, and after a harrowing journey, which evidently this ship traveled way down to what is now France and then back up, and there were storms, and it's almost like St. Paul in one of his missionary journeys, if you read those in the book of Acts. Eventually he makes it home, and much to the surprise of his family, who see him, they thought he was dead. So everyone's overcome with gratitude to God, and Patrick feels compelled to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and enter seminary and becomes a priest. And then, upon being a priest, he eventually becomes the pastor of a church, and later is consecrated as a bishop. Okay. So now we have Bishop Patrick. But then one night, he's 48 years old, and he hears another voice, and it gets his attention. It's an Irish accent, and it says, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." So here's where Patrick's story comes full circle. You know, it's like the story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, and God taking a bad thing and turning it good. Well, that's kind of what's happening now for Patrick as well. His years of being a slave is going to be a blessing for him and for the people of Ireland. Obviously, his family is not excited that he's going to be returning back to Ireland, or that he wants to this barbarian group of people. And the truth of the matter is, well, let me put it this way. If you were to say to your friends or family, I heard God tell me that I need to, you name it, move to Bakersfield to start a church, they might think twice. And I'm just using Bakersfield as the worst possible place you could ever go. I'm joking. And so any personal conviction a person has based on hearing a voice or dreaming a dream, you know, people are going to not be entirely excited about. Well, that's what takes place with Patrick, not only with his family, but with the other priests and bishops. They say, that's funny, because God didn't tell me that's what you were going to be doing. So at any rate, he doesn't get any support. And he gathers together a small group of people from his church, and they set sail for Ireland, and they recognize they're never coming back. This is farewell for good. And now, though, and this is important, now he's returning back to Ireland in his mind as a missionary, which would be accurate, but in the minds of many of the Irish, as a runaway slave. So there is a possibility of a price on his head. So his journey back to Ireland, this time his group land in Wicklow, which you see now. I don't have a pointer in this, but that star is, you know, the Wicklow area. Waterford, you can see maybe, perhaps, Waterford Bay, which is south of Wicklow. That's where he would have landed as a slave and made the journey basically northeast to get up to the place where he was a shepherd. So now they land in Wicklow. No, it turns everything off. Okay. So at any rate, and they land at the mouth of this river, and evidently the townspeople were not hospitable to. Why would they be, right? They're coming from the UK. They're coming from Great Britain. They're coming from those people. Those people are not us. And so, immediately there's this hesitancy about Patrick and his community. So, rather than stick around and try to make friends, they start going north. And they end up in this area that becomes really, really important. And on the way, they make some journeys along the coast. But this location was called then Maginus. And here they establish their very first church that was donated by the landowner, who himself was not excited about Patrick and his group. I have to, again, this is one of those stories that I'm not quite sure, but evidently the landowner, the dogs of the landowner began to attack Patrick and his group, and Patrick stood out in front of the group and stared down the dogs. And the landowner was so impressed with that, he knew that he was in the presence of a holy person, and then gave the property to build this church. So this is the sign erected, and now the town is called Seoul, S-A-U, sounds like, or it should be Saul, but Seoul. On this site, the Church of St. Patrick was built first time in 1432. And this gives you an idea of what that church looks like. And there's a graveyard. There's a graveyard connected to all the churches, right? And that's further off on the left side. And which, by the way, this is not the original church, right? This church, I think, was erected in 1962, something like that. We're trying to remember that. But at any rate, okay, so I mentioned it was a barn that they started the church in. Well, that word in the Irish language is Saul or Soul. So that's how they get this. The name of the town is now called Seoul. And it's in the county Down. So another image, now you can see what part of the graveyard looks like there. So at any rate, this becomes kind of the home base for Patrick to begin to expand out. And see, in his mind, he was wanting to go back to the location closer to Belfast. But they used this as their beginning point and began to spread out from here. Eventually, his journeys took him to a number of towns and hamlets in a widening circle, largely in the center and northern part of Ireland. So those of you who love visiting the southern parts of Ireland, which I am one of those, Patrick didn't have much footprint in the southern part of Ireland, going more north than south. One of the most interesting places is a castle called Cashel Church, or Cashel Castle, in County Tipperary. It's also known as the Rock of Cashel. And this is the home of a territorial king by the name of Onegus. And it sits, as you can tell, high on a knoll, and as you're driving, you can see it in some distance before you eventually arrive. It's a beautiful old castle. And the story is, again, I think this is a 7th century story, that Patrick converted the king, and while baptizing him, accidentally impaled the king's foot with his crozier, the long cross that he would carry. And the king didn't do anything about it, figuring that, well, this was a part of what being baptized meant. It gets stuck in the foot. The town of Armagh in County Armagh, and which, by the way, if you travel in Ireland, we're used to saying, well, I'm from Visalia in Tulare County. Well, in Ireland, they turn it around. So everything is county such, as opposed to such county. In County Armagh, Patrick builds a church in 444, which then becomes a monastic settlement, and largely in conflict with the Roman Catholic Church in Great Britain, it becomes the center of identity for those who followed Patrick in Ireland. So it was a hotly debated location. The Roman Catholics from Great Britain wanted to claim this as our own, and the Irish would have nothing to do with that. So Armagh today would be considered the central location of all that is religious in the whole of Ireland. And so you know that there are two Irelands. There's the Protestant Ireland and the Catholic Ireland. So now we're moving up. That star places us in Armagh, where Patrick kind of creates the seat of his missionary work. And so there are two St. Patrick's cathedrals that are led by prelates who run the religious world in Ireland. One Roman Catholic, that would be the one on the left, and one Anglican, the one that is on the right. So going to Armagh, you have to see both of those in order to pay respect to Patrick. And so that's the reality as well. This typifies the reality of Ireland. It is divided in many respects, and it has been divided for many, many years. And so what became, the question that I have is, what became to this price on Patrick's head? I mean, he again is returning back to Ireland as a runaway slave. What became to all of that? Well, Patrick's missionary work did not go without conflict. I mean, there was multiple conflict. But we're not clear whether or not any of the conflict was as a result of him being an escaped slave, but rather the manner in which he did his work. There were accusations that, and I indicated that there was stories that were told years later about his impropriety with women. Again, I would downplay that significantly, but I think there is credibility to the way that they felt that Patrick was unfairly taking advantage of the kings and their money by kind of siphoning off money for himself, as opposed to taking that money and distributing it to the poor people. So that autobiography that I mentioned earlier, Confessio, it actually is a letter, the history of which is such. It's a letter that he's writing in defense of those who are charging him for accepting improper gifts for the work that he was doing. He claims in the letter never, ever to have received any monetary value over and above what was initially agreed upon, and that all monies that he would receive in excess, he would return to the kings, and that the women that came with him or followed him from those locations, many of which were wealthy, he received no gifts from them. He received no money for baptisms, and he claimed that there were thousands of baptisms, and I would imagine that's accurate, nor did he receive any money for ordinations, and that he would go so far as to personally pay for the costs of sons of kings who wanted to follow him. So this Confessio becomes his defense of accusations that people in the church are making against him. Additionally, and this is where conflict also becomes more of an issue, he chooses not to receive, again, money from the kings for his personal well-being. He receives money from kings in order to distribute for poor people, but he chooses not to receive it for himself. And that becomes a social no-no. And so many of the kings, some of the kings took personal affront with Patrick, and at some times even had him shackled, imprisoned, beaten, and even at one point, evidently, he was awaiting execution for having been on the negative side of a territorial or feudal king. He was also charged, he also claimed to have been a captive for 60 days. Doesn't give any detail of why, what were the conditions for that, but simply put, Patrick was always considered, among the Irish, always considered a foreigner without any legal protection. So no matter what he was able to accomplish, there was always a black cloud that seemed to be following him or keeping him in check. Why was Patrick so successful? What was it about him and his methodology that made his work in Ireland so effective? Because there were other missionaries that landed on the shores of Ireland with virtually no effectiveness whatsoever. So why Patrick? 3 things come to mind. First, as I said earlier, he knew the people. He spoke the language. He understood the cultural medium and importances. And he really loved them. So that goes a long way. That's a huge issue. Secondly, he would start high but go low, meaning he would always go to the kings first. He would always address them and present himself to the kings. But they were not his primary focus. His primary focus were the poorest of the poor. And so he had this heart for the people who were subjugated, who were left in distress, because that's the life that he knew, right, as a slave. So he built a strong clientele of followers of other slaves and people who were indentured and those who were throwaway within the particular fiefdoms. And then third, he knew how to create communities. And, this is a community. We are connected in a communal understanding of importance, of value, of theology, of things that bind us together. And Patrick got that. He understood the importance of belonging. What is that sense that says that apart from, the basic necessities that we have of food and shelter, it's the ability to connect and to be appreciated and to know that we belong, how important that is. And so he took that to the farthest degree and built these communities with very rigid rules. If you're going to be a part of the community, you just can't come and do what you want, kind of a thing. You live accountable to one another. You live with the sense that we're all in this together. And they would create these communities that were walled off cities, basically. So you had to know somebody in order to come into the community. You had to be invited in. But once in and once apart, your whole life took a turn. And you became something that you weren't before. And right now there is, I don't know how big it is, but there is an evangelical focus of rediscovering the value of evangelizing like St. Patrick, of what does it take to create communities of people of faith in order to survive, but also to thrive. So those are the 3 things that, from my standpoint, Patrick did well and was effective at developing the church. The church then, as the church now, had a lot of rules and regulations. And this is what I love about Patrick more than anything else. He didn't play by those rules. He let women be church leaders. He allowed lay people to preside at worship. He didn't make the people do liturgy in the Latin, and he didn't hesitate to baptize people without any sort of ceremonial preparation. I mean, if somebody came to him, wanted to be baptized, good enough for him, he would do it. And so while the church was struggling in the rest of Europe, the church in Ireland was growing. The date of Patrick's death is verified as March 17th, but we're not sure of his birth, as I said earlier. Now, the year of his death is a bit unclear. 492 is kind of the accepted. Some say 493. I've also seen others postulated as early as 460. I don't put a lot of credibility. And if it was 492, then he was probably 120 years old when he passed. There are some scholars that reported that Patrick, in fact, did not stay in Ireland, went back to the mainland, and eventually became a pastor in Glastonbury in Great Britain and died there. But most would agree that that's not verifiable. Interestingly, while Patrick traveled all over the Irish island, he died within a couple of miles of where he first came to ground to start his ministry, near that hamlet of Seoul on the eastern edge of Ireland. He received his final communion from the bishop of that area. His body was then loaded onto a cart that was driven by 2 oxen that had never pulled a cart before. I don't know why. They placed Patrick's body on a cart, and these oxen took off. And the determination was wherever the cart stops, wherever the oxen stop, is where. It's really hard to see, right? What it says is that it gives a little bit of background of Patrick, but it indicates that Patrick is not solely buried under this rock. 2 other individuals of significant importance for the Irish is buried there. In the late 12th century, an Anglo-Norman knight by the name of John de Cossey claimed to have gathered the relics of 2 additional, quote-unquote, saints, Saint Bridget and Saint Columba, also known as Comseal, and they're buried under this rock along with Patrick. So this knight gathered these bones from other locations of which I don't know, brought them here, they deposited them where Patrick is. Columba was ordained in 551 and established monasteries in Derry and Douro, as well as Christian communities in additional locations. And like Patrick, there were fanciful stories told about him, such as battling with the Loch Ness Monster and performing miracles. The story of Bridget is a little bit more obscure. She was born into a noble family, at least her father was noble, but the mother was an enslaved woman she was baptized by Patrick. And after birth, she was sold into a Druid home and then later converted to Christianity. Similarity, there were many myths about Bridget that helped kind of establish her identity in Kildare, a city, and noted for her charitable actions. Patrick had an incredible, undeniable impact on the entire Ireland, but also on Christianity as we know it today. But if for no other reason than simply the stories told about him, there is an incredible literal footprint of Patrick all throughout Ireland. By my count, there are 22 townships and communities alone with the name of Kilpatrick. And Kil is the old Irish word for church, which implied that Patrick had established a church there. But again, a lot of these Kilpatrick locations are in the south. So probably not. But in addition to Kilpatrick, there are another 3 areas named Temple Patrick, presumably because there's a temple there. And then there are a host of other locations such as Ard Patrick, Knock Patrick, Patrick's Well, Patrick's Rock, Glass Patrick, Holm Patrick, Bailey Patrick, Leck Patrick, Boltree Patrick, Cross Patrick, Ramouthcon Patrick, Lipscomb Patrick, Bell Patrick, Patrickstown, and Downpatrick, all connecting in one another, in one way or another, Patrick's influence, perhaps in the area, if not some landform that was noted to have Patrick's footprints on it. So that's where I'm going to leave the conversation to Patrick for a moment. Can't talk about Ireland without talking about the potato famine. Potato famine's a big deal even to this day, and you might say any of the current issues that exist in the rife between the Republic and Northern Ireland may go back to the potato famine. So we would be remiss if we don't touch upon this. This is an issue that challenged the religious and political identities of what it meant to be Irish and long pitted the Roman Catholic against the Protestant. Roman Catholic being the Republic of Ireland, the Protestants being now known as Northern Ireland. So we begin in the 17th century. Ireland, thanks to Patrick, is a Roman Catholic country. However, neighbors to the east, the Anglican English and the Presbyterian Scots, began to settle in Ireland in that northern location. And they bought up a tremendous amount of land. Again, Ireland wasn't a country, and so when I say they bought up land, they took it. And they justified their taking by submitting their land claims with Great Britain. And Great Britain didn't have any political control, but it seemed to work. Obviously, the Irish present there, they were very unhappy with this, but what could they do? These landowners came in not only with money, but with also armies, militias. And so there was conflict, there were sectarian wars between the native Catholics, we'll call them, and the Protestant planters, both resulting in Protestant victories. The first was the Irish Confederate War of 1641 to 1658, or 1653. The second was the Williamette War of 1689 to 1691, and the reason why that one's really important, Williamette was William of Orange, who would eventually be declared King of Ireland, and because of his status of being in charge of the region of Orange in Great Britain, orange is the color of Northern Ireland today. For the next 100 years, Ireland was united under parliamentary rule and parliamentary persuasion, and the sectarian violence that continued did not allow the Roman Catholics to gain any additional freedoms. In 1801, Ireland was brought into the United Kingdom following the passage of what's called the Acts of Union. And while there was representation, Irish representation in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, don't be surprised that 70% of the elected officials were landowners or sons of landowners. So they're the ones with the money. It goes without saying that a large percentage were Anglican. Many, if not most, were landowners who spent very little time in Ireland themselves and yet leased out their land and received incredible profits from the leasing. In 1482 or 1842, for instance, roughly 6 billion pounds were remitted out of Ireland, never to return. So there was an incredible inequity gap in trade that Ireland was losing. The Irish population, again, largely Roman Catholic and largely expanding. Why would they expand? Because they're Catholics, right? And so the families were gaining in size. The towns were growing. In 1700, the population of the entire island was 2 million people. By the middle of the 1800s, so 150 years later, the population was now 8 million people. 2/3 were dependent on agriculture to survive, but barely had a living wage. The tenant farms that they lived in were subdivided into extremely small parcels that by the middle of the 1800s, 1/3 of the farms, after rent was paid, which was exorbitant, did not support the families who lived on them. If this was bad enough, then came the potato famine. Potatoes were the crop of Ireland since the 1700s. By the 1800s, the potato became the primary food source for 1/3 of the population, largely the poorest population. And while there were episodic crop failures due to dry rot and drought, in 1844, a parasite known, I'm not even going to tell you what it was called, a parasite enters into the whole country. And it's not only in Ireland. The United States was experiencing it. Other European countries were experiencing it. But Ireland depended on potatoes unlike any other of those countries. In 1845, crop loss was reported to be 1/3. In 1846, 3/4 were lost. In 1846, reports of people dying in the streets of hunger began to be announced. Scarcity continued in 1847, 1848. Because over 3 million Irish were totally dependent on potatoes for food, hunger and famine was widespread. The response of the British government was swift and inadequate. Food was imported and Irish crops were prevented from being exported in order to keep the food on the island, but conversely driving up the costs of food and the production was down. The most damaging government response was a clause that was added called the Gregory Clause after an Anglo-Irish politician by the name of William Gregory that stated anyone who was a farmer could be evicted from their farm if they had if they had more than 1/4 of an acre. Well, they all had more than 1/4 of an acre. And so they were being evicted incredible numbers by the military. The net effect was that 1 million people died of disease and starvation, and another 1 million immigrated to other countries, largely to North America. So in Dublin today, there is this remembrance of the potato famine that, should you go, you will no doubt see or have already seen. The British government has been soundly criticized for its lack of intervening, and even to this day of not expressing any government responsibility. More than 150 years have passed and there's no formal apology that has been expressed. Needless to say, the Irish sentiments have not forgotten that. And there is a strong current expectation that Britain owes them for this loss. Annually on a Sunday in May, the Irish observe National Famine Commemoration Day. So now we're going to jump forward into what you've heard, perhaps, as referred to the Troubles, a history of bad blood between the Irish nationalists, that is, the Roman Catholics, and the British Unionists. By the early 20th century, tensions had risen considerably, especially in the northern counties where there was Protestant presence. And this would become known as the First Troubles in Ireland. In April 1916, a political group known as the Irish Republicans began to take up arms in force against the British nationalists for power in what is called now the Easter Rising. Although the revolt was defeated, there gained a groundswell of support for greater Irish independence, and in 1918, the Irish Republican Party, called Sinn Féin, won a landslide victory and began a movement to form a breakaway government and declare Irish independence. Sinn Féin. By this time, a fully formed militia called the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was not only active but effective in countering the British military. This was the start of the Irish War for Independence. While the IRA was outmanned by the British military by a basic count of 3-1, the IRA killed twice as many British as Irish. However, hundreds of civilians died in the conflict as well. The conflict reached a climax on Sunday, November 1920 in Dublin. 14 British operatives were assassinated. This is now known as Bloody Sunday. The British forces responded with a destructive assault, and over the next 7 months, 1,000 people were killed, 4,500 Republicans were interned, and homes and businesses were destroyed. Most of the conflict taking place again up in the north, where there was that collision of the Republican Irish, the Catholics, and the Unionists, the Anglicans. In May 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was passed by the British Parliament, positioning Ireland into two nations consisting of 6 counties in the north and 26 counties in the south under self-rule, the Republic of Ireland. Those desiring to remove British influence entirely from Ireland initiated a conflict within themselves. So there were many Irish who were not happy with that agreement. They wanted the Northerners, they wanted the Anglicans, the pro-British, the Unionists to be removed entirely. But the IRA under Sinn Féin said, no, we're going to work this out some way together. And so there was civil war taking place within the Irish Republic between 1821 and 1823, which was extremely bloody, but ended in the defeat of the anti-treaty party. So one would make a mistake to think that that settled all of the conflict. Well, it didn't. Both North and South, following the Anglo-Irish Treaty, continued a skirmish in locations. There were bloody times all throughout the counties, but particularly again in the northern counties. With the exception of the anti-treaty party, most of the conflict in Ireland took place between the Irish Republicans and the Irish Unionists, so the North and the South. It's interesting to me that at no time, at least in information that I've been able to find, in a country that really depended on the evangelical work of St. Patrick, nobody in these days were talking about St. Patrick. You know, nobody said, well, Patrick was forming us into communities to get along. That didn't matter. So if you ever stumble upon anything that people wrote about Patrick's comment, or what would be Patrick's comment about these early troubles, I'd sure like to know. But now this brings us to a more recent conflict in Ireland that you probably are more familiar with, also known as the Troubles, but probably known best as the Troubles 2.0. So for 100 years or so, things kind of go along. It's not great, but things they're existing, they're coexisting. But things get intense in the 1960s when a campaign was started in the northern counties among what was called the North Ireland Civil Rights Association to end discrimination against the Roman Catholics. Increasingly, tensions led to August 1969, when riots took place and the British military was deployed. The primary insurgents for the rebellion were the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and the Irish National Liberation Army on one side, and the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force on the other. The British Army intended to be a neutral presence, but more than you can imagine, they began to campaign along with the Northern Unionists. There was incredible, significant human loss, bombings, infrastructure, commercial, political targets. Loyalists were attacked by Republicans and the wider Catholic community in what was called as retaliation. The crescendo of this conflict took place on January 30th, 1972, and you might remember this more particularly as Bloody Sunday. It's actually Bloody Sunday 2.0. At this march, organized by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association in a city called Derry, British soldiers opened fire, shooting 26 unarmed civilians while running away and attending to the wounded. In all, 14 people died. All were Catholic. The conflict intensified in the weeks and months to follow. Car bombings, guerrilla warfare was standard fare. In all, between 1968 and 1998, 1,049 British soldiers died, 11 North Ireland police died, 162 North Ireland paramilitary loyalists died. Representing the Republic, 368 Irish paramilitary were killed, and the collateral damage included the deaths of 1,840 people and another 45,000 injured. We stopped at a pub for dinner in Belfast. It's kind of hard to see, but this is one of those large advertising mirrors that you oftentimes see, or if you go to Vintage Press, they have those on the wall. But what you can't see well is that it's cracked. It's a myriad of cracks, and there's a sign indicating that this was called the Crown Liquor Saloon in 1898, founded. That piece was damaged by a bomb explosion in 1993 and subsequently restored and reinstated in 1999. So there's this effort in Northern Ireland to continue to remember, but to rebuild their lives as best as they possibly can. I am here to tell you, and some of you who have traveled, you know that there's still conflict, right? There's still unease between North and South in many regards. And on April 10th, 1998, some of you will remember this, under the chair of George Mitchell from the United States, sent by President Bill Clinton, whom the Irish revere. Bill Clinton is considered an extremely important individual for his work in bringing peace to those countries. The Good Friday Accord or agreement was signed in Belfast by the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, and it called for an end to the conflict, a disarming of the paramilitary groups, such as the IRA, the return of prisoners, and the establishment of rights for underrepresented groups, largely in North Ireland. Once again, given the significance to St. Patrick and his influence upon the whole island, it surprises me that I have not stumbled upon words, sermons, edicts, doctrine, tenets put out by either Catholic or Protestant calling for Christianity in this country that was so heavily influenced by Patrick. So it just gives you an idea. Some of you have gone with me on tours in the past. We did a tour back in 1990 to Germany, and Phil and Rita Olson were on that one, and that was fascinating because we were there as the wall was coming down. And then in 2017, in honor or recognition of the 500 years of Martin Luther, nailing the theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, we went back. And at that point, we connected with a tour guide from Germany, well respected and very insightful individual. And we enjoyed that one so much. And again, I just love these ideas of talking about how cultures have been affected by individuals like Martin Luther, like St. Patrick. So in 2019, we did another tour, and this one was in Great Britain and in Scotland. So the influence that John Knox, for instance, had particularly on Scotland, fascinated by that influence. I'm not a John Knox fan by any stretch, but fascinated how he was able to galvanize a group of people. Then in 2022, was that right? 2022 or 2023? 23, we did a trip to Switzerland to kind of follow John Calvin and see what was he all about and what was his influence. And that wasn't only Calvin, it was also Huldrych Zwingli. So I've been fascinated, and I thought this would be the most wonderful way to finish this kind of focus of these powerful reformers, because for me, Patrick is an incredibly important person in the life of the church. We put together with this same tour guide from Germany, a tour to Ireland. And so maybe, Anne, could I ask you, I don't think I have enough for everybody, but if you could grab some and share them around the table. And this is a first draft item, and it's not going to be sufficient. It's not going to give you details of costs and such, but it'll give you an idea of the general itinerary that we're looking at. So the idea is that the trip would take place in April. April 25th would be the travel date that we would be arriving. With this travel guide that we have, he has a stateside travel agency out of Pennsylvania that we've now worked with on 2 occasions, who do a wonderful job of setting up travel details. Some people, will want to maybe travel early, or some people want to travel late. So it's not an idea that everyone's traveling in the plane together to arrive. You could work out your own details, but the idea is that we would all begin the tour on travel on the 25th, arriving for our first day on April 26th. Location would be arrival in Dublin, and our departure would also be in Dublin. And so I'm not going to spend considerable time going through this with you, but as you look at the itinerary, you'll notice that the locations, the sites are largely from the central part of Ireland going up north. So we're not going down to the Ring of Kerry, for instance, or to the Dingle Peninsula, which are some of the most beautiful locations. We just don't have that amount of time. And by the way, a lot of those roads are not conditioned for tour buses. They're so small, so tight. If any of you who have driven in Ireland know what it's like to be driving down one of these very narrow roads with hedgerows on either side and seeing a tour bus come at you, you'll know what it's like to pray, and the Lord's Prayer will become very familiar. You'll have that in mind. So some of the sites that I identified here, we would be seeing, the Rock of Cashel, for instance, going up to Armagh, visiting the Cliffs of Moher, which is probably one of the most well-known sites in all of Ireland, this incredible 300-foot cliffs that you're looking out over the Atlantic Ocean, and it's truly breathtaking. the Dublin sites. So if you've heard about the Book of Kells, for instance, that would be one of the sites at the library. John?
Yeah, this says it ends on May 10th, not September 4th.
Yeah, should be May 10th. He threw this together really quickly. Oh, up here? No, I'm going to be there that whole time. No, that should be May 4th. Thanks, John. So then going all the way up to Dublin and Giant's Causeway, if that sounds familiar, kind of a mythological place that is truly a geographical or a geological phenomenon in how the lava beds created this unique setting. It's just phenomenal. So all of which say, you take your time, look at this, but again, understand that this is all preliminary. It doesn't have the date. It does have the dates. It doesn't have the costs, and those are being worked out right now. And all I can tell you about a tour such as this is that his name is Folker. Folker doesn't skimp. He doesn't go for, Best Western style hotels. He goes for very comfortable hotels because he understands travel is hard. You're working extremely hard, traveling and dealing with everything from weather interferences to or just not feeling well, all the things that go into travel. And so he creates a very comfortable travel experience. And there's downtime and there's excursions that get built into the process. And if anybody who's interested is a golfer, there is actually one day that is designed for golf. It would be our last day because we're going to be at a really cool golf resort. So what my commitment to you is that if this sounds at all interesting, I will have the finished brochures in the church office, and those will be that will be announced. You'll be told that you can pick up a brochure at the church office. So I don't know what the deposit amount is. I don't know when the deadline for the deposit is. I don't know any of that stuff at this point, but it will be forthcoming. And it would be, one of those wild experiences. But I do have to tell you this. Again, because of the travel restrictions in terms of buses and such, we're only going to be in one bus. So once that bus gets filled up, then we have to close off the number of people who can come along. So again, if you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to fill that in for you at a later date. But as I close, I just love this. This is in the Confessio of St. Patrick. Evidently, it's called St. Patrick's breastplate. I'm not entirely sure why breastplate, other than that the symbolism that St. Paul uses about the breastplate of righteousness. For somehow that took on a meaning for Patrick of being clad with this confidence of God wherever you go, whatever you do, whatever challenges you face. So this is how I close tonight, and I invite you to say it along with me. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in the eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through the belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. And I might add, Phil Cherney would use this as his daily devotions. I covered a lot of stuff, probably not well, and probably in such a manner that you're really confused, especially about the troubles. Don't be troubled by that. Any quick questions that I can answer for you? If not, I'll be sticking around and can answer anything. But
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bill?
Well, realizing that on this next trip, time, of course, is always an issue. You had a day to spend at the Titanic Museum.
Which is in the itinerary.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's excellent.
Yeah, when we're in Belfast, we'll be going to the Titanic. It is fascinating. Anything else? So as soon as I hear about stuff, I will certainly let you know. For those that I have contact information from previous tours, I will also be sending out information because there are some who have traveled outside of our area, like Janice Helgeson, for instance, and Donna Shallon, who are interested in receiving information. So I'll send that to them as well. But again, you'll be informed so that the stuff is at the church office to pick up. Otherwise, thank you for your time. Ireland is a fascinating location. Patrick is a fascinating figure in church history, and it would do us well to learn a lot more about him as we try to be the church going forward. So thanks for coming out tonight.